language. And she basically said that foreign language education is in a state of crisis. And there is a danger if we don't start looking at the way we're teaching language and try to come up with changes and alterations to what we're currently doing that would better fit our students' needs, as well as how English is changing and the environment that we're living in. So those were like the three main aspects that she was looking at. And she outlined some of the issues, the dangers, and then she also talks about some of the solutions. And so we'll go over that today. I'll stop here and there and just ask if there are any questions or anything that rings true to you from your own perspective as an English teacher and or person of interest in English. Okay, so the first thing that Dr. Cramch did was she wanted to define foreign language, because in the States there's very different definitions that people go by, and she wanted to make sure that all of us sitting in the audience were clear what she meant. So, foreign language, language learned in institutional settings by speakers of the dominant language. So here, English is a foreign language, right? Because people in the dominant language are sitting in an institution learning English. So it's the same. We can look at it in the same way. The second language is language taught to the immigrant community within the United States. So that's how it's looked at. Okay, so one of the first things that she was talking about is how globalization is really making it more difficult for us to get a handle on what is English, how should we be teaching English in the classroom, and how we are teaching it now, and how should we be teaching it, those questions in between that, like what is going on, what are the changes that have been made, and what should we do. So basically, one of the pillars of this, and this was from the work of Blumhart in 2010, we have community, culture, communication, and information. These are the aspects that we think about when we think of language. And these are also the aspects that come into sort of a problem. They're really hard questions, you know? And it's complicated for me too, because I was like, oh my gosh, what have I just done for 1.5 years here with you all? Coming in and saying X, Y, and Z. Okay, she was also talking about language equality, and that all languages are equal, but only somewhat. They're not totally equal. So the example she gave was, again, going back to China, and the Confucius Institute is an institute kind of like British Council, kind of like the Goethe, I'm not saying that correct in German, but that Goethe Institute or whatever. And so they teach Chinese culture and they teach Chinese language, but they don't teach Cantonese, even though that is a language that originated in China. So what we're learning directly from that is that Cantonese is equal to Mandarin, but it's not as important. So I think what she was trying to say with that is, with English, we have to be very careful that we're not teaching everyone English at the expense of another, even more important language for that group of people. And an example she gave is within the European region, one of the things that she was saying is, even 100 years ago, if you were in France, you would probably speak the languages of your bordering countries, your neighbors. You will have business, you will need to be able to communicate with each other. But if you look at these statistics, so 35% of the students are now learning English, which is a huge jump. Only 14% of neighboring countries to France or Germany are learning French or German. That's a big difference. That's more than half, well, a little more than half. But what that's saying is that neighbors are no longer going to be able to communicate in a common language of the neighbor. They're going to be using English as a more dominant language. And I think the point was there's no right and there's no wrong, but this is something to consider, because is it really what we want to do? I think the Europeans are not so excited about these statistics, so what they did is they said, we're going to have 3 languages now. So we're going to have a neighboring language, we're going to have English, and we're going to have our language. Right? So that was one of the ways, so it's English plus a local language was one of the ways that they decided to deal with this problem. Or they are deciding. It has not been implemented yet everywhere. Okay, so we have, in this context, the purity, authenticity section, which you remember is defined by the native speaker, defined by the countries where this is important. And then we have versus cultural hybridity. So this is what English language becomes when you're actually using it and how it adapts itself to different cultures and how people of that culture begin to use language. So again, as I mentioned previously, she said that nation states sponsor what the standard language is because, well, they're the boundaries developed by national standards of native speakers. So they have something they gain from that. However, you can see starting as early as 2009, there are researchers that are arguing for a different way, where we have more of a hybrid use, which is informed by how people are actually using the language versus what the standard language is. Because I can tell you, even my friends don't use standard English all the time when they're in communication. And we have to think about what are we actually teaching our students to do. Whoops. How are they going to be using English? Because some of the students that I've had, if they went and they talked to my friends in Atlanta, they wouldn't understand like 80% of what was said. So what really is my role? What is standard English and how should it be defined? Or should we be teaching them to use the hybrid version, or at least have elements of hybridity taught in class that would enable them to go into different cultures? The UK is like this too. Sometimes I don't even know what they're saying. And they're speaking in English. It's my native language. So what should we teach? Is basically what she's asking. Some examples of this, of how hybridity has come across, and after I go through these, I'd like maybe you to let me know if you can think of any examples as well from this culture. The first one is thank you. And this was a story that she told about, she was in two Chinese girls. They were in a store trying on clothes, and one of them tried on an outfit and it looked really good, and her friend said, that looks nice, and she said, thank you. And Dr. Cranch was like, hold on, why would you use English to say thank you? And it was explained to her that in Chinese, for that particular type of interaction, you don't say thank you. You can say thank you, if you're like buying something or something like that, but you don't say thank you for that interaction. And so in order to get around their social norm and the norm of the language, they use English to express something they feel should be expressed but isn't in their culture. Yeah.
Sorry. how do they feel that it should be if it's not their culture and they're not used to doing it? And what if they didn't know English, for example?
Well, I mean, English, I don't think you have to know English to be able to use words and phrases. I hear people all the time saying, like, on the phone, just like, Ukrainian, 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 okay, Ukrainian, 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 you know, or like just basic words. You also see it on television where you'll be watching a program and, you know, I'm not understanding anything, English, what? Where did that come from? But it doesn't necessarily mean they know it, right? But I think what you're seeing here is the movies and the impact that that expression of culture has on other cultures and how it changes their own definition of culture. And you can see it, I wish I could think of an example from the States, but I know myself from living in China and living in Asia for many years, I have a very different cultural norming than a typical American. And even in the States, sometimes things that I do are not correct for the culture. So that's a great question, though, and I think that that's one of the areas she's actually exploring. And that's why I wanted to share this with you, because I think these are really important questions for us to be talking about and to be asking. So this one was my favorite example that she gave. This was a road sign. So you know that when you have a road sign, this is an agreed upon language form, right? Because you don't just put, it was a government-sponsored road sign. You don't just put random road signs up with, like, language errors. I mean, maybe sometimes you do. But generally speaking, that's not done. And I believe this was in Austria. And can anyone read that? Do you know what it means?
East means east. Vienna is happy.
Exactly. Vienna is happy. And when she saw that sign, she was like, whoa, 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 why would you say Vienna is happy? Mm-hmm. Because she said, as I mentioned, she speaks German very well. And some of the signs that were translated in German in some of the tourist sections and the areas of town were very standard, very traditionally used. And then suddenly you have something like this. And she said that doesn't make any sense. So she asked her friends and they're like, oh yeah, because it's like the American happy. It's a superficial happy. We're not really metaphysically happy that you are here. But we're like, happy that you're here. So there was a different meaning behind the choice of the word, and they chose English because they wanted to project superficiality. I was like, ouch. But I thought that was really interesting. So the last one is in French, and it's too much. It just basically, again, she was like, wait a minute. My native language is French. When did you start using this? And basically, she was told, according to her story, that there's no real word for over the top. Like, just aggressively too much. Mm-hmm. And so they have taken the American or the English words of too much to create a new slang for over the top that they're using in French. So this is hybridity, right? When you have cultural influence in the choice of words and how it's added to your own language and your perception of English. Isn't that interesting? Can you think of any words here?
Line in the book, it's a Russian expression, but I put it in my Ukrainian phrase, and everybody is happy. People from Georgia, when they use vulgar words, because they're very religious, usually they use Russian words. You know, and everything is okay.
Right. You also?
By the way, we are buying just Happy Meal in McDonald's. But I guess so not everybody knows what does it mean.
This is true. And that's interesting too, to think that like what we buy, we may not know the meaning. And what does that mean? But what about English influence? Yeah.
Well, I don't know about like people on the street. Well, if they both know English, like for example, me and my friend, even though she's not teaching English, she just knows it. We might like when you teach English, you sometimes begin not like to say think English would be like too loud to say something like this. But sometimes English words come into my mind more often, like more quickly than the Russian equivalent, and I might just say it and she understands me, and like something like this might happen. And in the office, like office workers, sometimes they use English words because it's just like it's what they are speaking about is an English thing, and it's sometimes not yet implemented in Ukraine in general, or just there is no new word made for this. Like I don't know what I'm speaking about, but feedback, for example, the word
Right.
feedback, there is like a translation of the word feedback, but feedback is like feedback. It's not обратная связь, which is boring and like I don't know. So people use stuff like this just to make their language more, I don't know, lively and
They use
modern.
many
and so
phrases
on.
without translation, like dress code or code dress.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody translates for Russian how I should be dressed, but in our company we have code dress. Everybody understands.
That's interesting. We know also IT, right? A lot of the language of IT is English, regardless, and you do if you're working in it, you understand it, for sure. Sciences, some of them, some of the newer sciences also have it.
For example, the letters HR, and like everyone uses HR, and some people add the suffix, like a Russian suffix for like ER, so HRR, so a person who does HR, but the Russian suffix to this HR thing, and they don't know what HR is. They just say HR, it's somebody who works with like people and so on, but it's not, nobody knows that it's human resource. Not nobody, but not everybody knows that it's human resources actually and what it means and so on.
That is fascinating. I love it. So those are perfect examples of what she's talking about, how English is kind of being used in different ways than we're expecting. And what does that mean for the English language classroom? So some of the things that she was talking about is we have begun questioning, according to Kern, which is obviously current research, we are questioning the authenticity of the native speaker. And remember, this is not all native speakers, it's just where the people who decide what is standard English, where they're coming from. That's what's being questioned. Like, why we are all buying into the idea of the native speaker. Because if you didn't buy into the idea of the native speaker and the standardization of English, there would be no standard, right? You would say, I don't agree with that. I think that it should be this way, or it should be expressed in this way. And you would not teach your students in the way that is expected by whoever created the standard. Does that make sense? Okay, so they're talking about how do we teach students about hybridity and how do we teach them with hybridity in the classroom? Where is the placement for that? Because it is common, it is being used. As you were mentioning earlier, like sometimes the words just pop out. And it's not like you're thinking really hard, oh, I want to use English, I'm going to show off or something. It's just the best way that you have to express what you needed to express in that particular moment of time. So what does that mean for us as teachers? So what do we do in the classroom about this? This is her general inquiry. And some of the changes that she sees is that, and this is not necessarily, there was no real answer for what do we do in the classroom. As I mentioned at the beginning of this workshop, AAAL, these questions that are posed are questions we'll see the answer to in 3, 5, 10 years. But they're not necessarily, we're not going to have the answers right away. But they're the things we should be thinking about. So language has become an added value, where what we mean by added value is people put it on their resume just to have it on the resume, but not necessarily because they wanted to communicate using the language. That's not really what they're interested in. They want whoever they're going to get a job with to see, oh, they speak English, they speak Spanish, they speak German, great, let's hire them. So it looks good, basically, to say that you have it. The other trend that researchers are noticing is communication is about sharing the value of communication, not communication of shared value. So we see this happening on Facebook. So we value communication on Facebook, but it's not really communication. It's the same with blogs. You put all your thoughts, all your ideas, every moment of your life, but you're not really communicating because you're not engaging in a discussion about what these ideas are. It's just like, I had this thought. And you communicate that just to communicate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So she's one of the ideas that she was coming at. So how do we engage students who are not communicating to communicate? Because the whole point of language is the exchange of shared ideas or values or whatever. So how do we work with a generation that's not interested in that? And then another side value is there a way to train the generation that's growing up not interested in that to communicate shared values through language? So what is the teacher's role? How can the teacher, through their own personal experiences, share with the students in a way that engages them to want to learn more about communicating for the purpose of sharing values? So an example that she gave for that was some of the struggles that she had with languages and some of the amazing opportunities and experiences that she wished she could communicate to her students because they really transformed her ability to learn language, but there really wasn't a space in the classroom for her to do that unless somebody asked a question. But these are not the kinds of questions that most students feel comfortable to ask and that most teachers feel willing to talk about. You know, tell me about your personal experience learning language. What? Turn to page 5. You know, like that's not gonna fly really. So these were some of the ideas that she was discussing. How do we make these changes? So our codes, our norms, our conventions, they're being destabilized right now. They are destabilized. So what is it that we're supposed to teach? How is it that we're supposed to approach students at this time? Oh, it was like mind-blowing, this workshop. This plenary that she gave. It was just so good. I wish I'm not doing a great job communicating. I'm sure I'm missing bits and pieces of it. But I really recommend some of the resources, going through and reading some of them about these topics because it was really fascinating, these questions. So the needs. Basically, we have to look at language from all of its elements. The historical elements, the political elements, the socioeconomic elements, etc., etc. It's not just language for language. All of these elements are combined. It's like when I was mentioning her example of the Chinese teachers teaching in a Chinese style, but people wanting their own background. that doesn't necessarily work. We have to consider more closely, like, how do all the cultural elements impact the class and how the language is taught and learned. So one of the things that she was also saying is that we need to have in our academic circles discussions and discourse about the marginalization of foreign-born language instructors, so non-native speakers of English, because they should not be marginalized. There is, and as one of the other presentations that I'm going to talk about later, like, there's a lot of really, really wonderful things that students can and should learn from non-native English-speaking teachers, more than they can learn from their native speakers, their native-speaking teachers, right? So the idea that we really have to consider how we think about native speakers versus ourselves, and that we're all at the same level, that there's no distinction, or, well, there's no level difference. What do you think about that?
When we teach colloquial language, certainly we need native speakers. And everybody says, I agree. Nobody says, we're on the same page. Everybody says, you're punished. Nobody says, you're grounded. But naturally, when you use any variant synonym, because you're a native speaker, it's powerful, it's good.
Okay, that's a good point. But there are, I think, a lot of resources that could help you to teach that without a native speaker.
But we're slow because we have to digest it ourselves.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah, because of course, as you said, there are some advantages in being the same the same nationality as the person who you are teaching, because you have also gone through the process of learning English and you can help from this viewpoint. But on the other hand, it's much easier for a native speaker to find out, like, if a native speaker has learned, for example, Spanish or French before, it's a similar process just of learning another language. And it's easier for them to become a language teacher, to read some methodology or something like this, than for us to learn English so good that we will never feel, oh my god, I'm still not good enough. We will always feel that we are not good enough.
But see, that's part of the issue, though. Like, what is good enough? I mean, who defines what colloquial phrases are being used? I go back to the US, I can communicate, I don't know all the colloquial phrases anymore. I've been gone 10 years. A lot changes, but I don't feel, when I'm teaching in the class, I don't feel like that's an issue. But what I'm hearing from you is that you feel like that might be an issue.
But you know, one of your advantages, I mean, if you're a native speaker, your phonetics, your utterance. I had an American teacher in my class, and he never corrected my students. And students made a lot of mistakes. And when I asked him why not, he said, I could not understand them, not because of their grammar, but because of their utterance, how they pronounce sentences. And for us to imitate you, because our students repeat, our melody repeat, our phonetics, and so on and so on. And it's not perfect. It's not even not perfect. Sometimes it's wrong.
Okay. When you go into that specific example, I would probably agree that it is helpful, but one of the things that you said is that the native speaker didn't actually do anything. So how was that helpful to the students? Right? Because they have to be trained to be able to teach phonetics, to recognize the errors, to hear them, and to actually teach the students where their tongue should be. Or where, you know, what part, is it voiced or voiceless, etc. So I agree and I disagree, because I think that for us, maybe we have to also look at, again, what is the standard to sound like a native speaker? That's something that's been set up for you by native speakers. Is that fair? No. Look at SLA research. What does SLA research say about pronunciation and fluency? Basically, after a certain time period, if you haven't started learning, good luck. Right? Because there's an optimal period for language learning and for getting the correct pronunciation, correct being native speaker-like. But if they are, so the example you gave was extreme because the students were not able to produce the utterances, the sounds that would make them be understood, right? They didn't have that. But a lot of students that I've heard are okay, they may have an accent, but who am I to say the point is, again, the communication. If they can speak in English and be understood, that's communication. You don't need a native speaker for that. I've met a lot of people throughout my travels who never met native speakers, and their English, the pronunciation, the sounds, syllable structures, etc., were okay.
But I had a private student, a girl about 22, 23, and she asked me to teach her English because she got acquainted with an American guy, and they're supposed to be a family. And it took us maybe 2 months. I taught her the ABC of English, and then we did not see each other maybe for half a year. And later I came across her suddenly, and her English was better than mine, because I call it pillow method. Because that American guy and that our Ukrainian lady, they became like a couple, and they talk naturally. She talked to a native speaker, she listened to him, and her English was without grammar, without that scientific stuff, but it was fluent, perfect according to pronunciation, and I was surprised with my studying and knowing nothing, and her enjoying and gained a lot. I don't know.
Okay, but we have to be careful about these because, first of all, we don't know if she was a really good language learner anyway. Because you could have had the same experience with me if I were the Ukrainian girl and there was an American guy, and I would be like, you need to speak Ukrainian. I can't learn English. And his Ukrainian may have gotten really good. So there's that. We do have to remember that some people really are talented in languages. So it's not fair to compare on that way. But again, it goes back to the same question is, what is the standard English, and why, just because she sounds differently and maybe speaks a little bit faster or whatever, why would you assume that she's more fluent than you are?
And feelings, when you feel the language, because it's the mother tongue. Not you use it artificially, correctly, but more with feelings. For example, my wife speaks Russian a lot with me, but when we have an argument, it's only Ukrainian, or Russian with Ukrainian accent. And she repeats my mother-in-law. She reminds.
That's hilarious. So I think, but actually what you're seeing here is really awesome, because this is exactly the debate that's going on, right? It's like these are, a lot of what you're saying is a lot of what we've been taught by the culture of English to expect, and by the culture of linguistics to expect about, native speakers versus non-native speakers and the feeling behind it. But I think the point of what she is saying is, why are they learning English? Is it because they need to have the pillow talk and have the emotions and have the expression? Or is it because they need to have a business transaction and then be done? Right? So you don't need a native speaker in order to teach them to have the business interaction. You don't want emotions in a business interaction, and then be done with it. So I really appreciate your comments because I think that a lot of us, including myself, would agree with much of what you've said. But I think her point was basically, what's the purpose? Why are we actually teaching them? How are they going to use it? And are we teaching them in a way that's the most effective? Because they don't need to sound like a native speaker. They need to sound in a way that is understandable to others so that they can communicate their meaning. Yeah.
Say one more. Really.
The students, it's the administration. It's all of us who are buying into this idea that non-native speaking teachers are not worth as much as native speaking teachers, because it's just not true. So, and I have seen when I was teaching in China, not in Macau, but in mainland, they would pay us more than they would pay the Chinese teachers because we were the native speakers. But not everyone was educated and had like a degree in TESOL like I did. There was literally a guy who used to cut lawns for a living, teaching English. And he was paid more than a Chinese professor who had an excellent command of the English language and could deliver very well to the students and had good results with the students. That's not okay, in my mind. But I mean, that's just an example, because the students would go to the person, and there's nothing wrong with cutting grass for a living or being a landscaper. That's a fine profession. But don't expect that you can do that and then suddenly teach a language, because there's like a whole background that you have to learn about grammar, about all kinds of things, right? So this sort of segues into the next presentation that I also saw at AAAL that kind of talks about how foreign-born language instructors in the U.S. perceive themselves and their worth for the university and their ability to teach language. So I will be interested to see if any of you can relate to this. So this was by Miranda Ma. Many of you may remember her. She came last year and gave us some workshops. She's at the University of Macau, and Misha Hamamoto. So they were talking, what they did was they looked at 3 teachers and they talked to them. They were all non-native English speaking teachers, and they were all working in institutions in intensive English programs in the United States. And they were looking at their identity, what they thought of themselves, the perspectives they had of themselves as non-native English speaking teachers. So they had this idea that probably they were a little marginalized, either by the university, by the students for the same reasons you just mentioned, or by themselves. So that's why we have a question mark, because that was kind of what they were looking for. And they were looking in terms of their professional world, their work environment, which includes students. And they were basically exploring the concept of identity for these women and its relationship to world, time, space, etc. that they're spending at the university working. Okay, so non-native English-speaking teacher, right? That's what that stands for. So some of the highlights and some of what the research shows is that they're actually better at teaching grammar. They have a shared experience. As you all mentioned previously, you had to learn the language, so you are the same as the students, and in some ways this helps them to become a role model for the students, because the students go, wow, she learned it and she's really great, I can do it too maybe, right? So they can, or he, so they can focus on that as well. So they did find that they felt a certain sense of legitimacy because they were hired at an institution in the United States to teach English. So they felt that it was a form of prestige, and whenever they wanted to return to their home country, that would look really good because obviously, like, their English, in their minds, their English was at a level where they could teach in the US. That's pretty good, right? So they had value also as a multilingual teacher, so they could teach their native language as well as the host language, but also they had value because they understood the nuances of the different languages and of English. Okay, we already talked about that, and all of them felt fairly well treated. None of them had any exceptional circumstances that they mentioned where they were marginalized or felt excluded from anything. And so the inferiority actually came from themselves. And the thing that I was hoping the research would go into, and it didn't touch at this time.
But she was really the best. And her final phrase was, "I doubt whether I know how to teach English." With her experience, and she wrote many books, she really was talented, but she finished with criticism in her own side, that she wasn't sure about principles, methods, which was the best how to teach.
But she was sure about her English, right?
Well, she had prestige, very high prestige.
Okay, because I think that it's also good to doubt yourself. Because I think that's what helps make us grow and learn as a teacher. And when you know that you know it, you should be scared because you probably don't know. So I think that was actually really amazing of her to say, because I think that shows a good teaching practice and a good teacher who is, even after like 30-something years of teaching, going, but did I do the right thing?
But you know, maybe she was right, because we have methodology how to teach English, for example, for secondary school. But when we speak about universities, well, all over the place.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, and this is, I think, some of what Kramsch was also talking about, is like, where do we go with this? One of the issues with having this standardized English, I guess I shouldn't say it this way. It's good to have standardization because you can test that. It's also bad to have standardization because you can test that. And tests don't always show your ability to use. It shows many things, but it doesn't necessarily show that you can have a conversation with me about many different topics, right? So it doesn't show that you can communicate fully all the time what your thoughts and feelings are, especially if it's like multiple choice, true, false, something like this. And so I think, I don't know, there's just so many questions that this particular topic raised. So I have no answers. And what we know from a lot of the research into how students learn and why students learn, when there's a meaningful connection to the language, they're more likely to be engaged with, motivated by, and learn the language, or whatever it was, whatever elements of the language that you were trying to teach them. And intentional content. I like seeing things. Teachers are required to evaluate what they need to teach directly so that the classroom time can be used for other methods of teaching, such as active learning strategies, peer instruction, problem-based learning, or mastery, or Socratic methods, depending on grade level and subject matter. So again, that's being thoughtful about what is it that I would lecture. So what can I put in the videos and what can I put online, and or send home with them, like paper copies. It doesn't have to only be online. And what would be better use of the class time so that it's student-centered. For the Socratic method, does anyone know the Socratic circle? This is sometimes very successful in university. You have everybody arranged almost in a circle. If we connected right here, we would be okay. And then you have two people in the center of the circle, and it could be the teacher or it could be another student, and they're talking, they're discussing a question, a concern in English. And what you do, everybody is listening. And what's fun to do to ensure that everybody is listening is after a few minutes, one of the students switches with someone from the audience. So obviously everyone has to be like an expert on the topic, but they all have to be listening, because if they're chosen to go in next, they have to be able to pick up immediately where that other student left off. So that's this is one of the ways to do the Socratic circle. And they find it interesting because a lot of students, especially when they're more in the upper levels, enjoy this activity. Lower levels I wouldn't necessarily do this with, because it may put too much pressure on them if they do not feel confident in their English ability, and or maybe they don't really have the ability to hold a sustained conversation at that point. So finally, number 4, the last of the pillars, is professional educators. So you will never be replaced as a teacher, because the point of the flipped classroom is not to get rid of the teacher like a MOOC, right? The point of the flipped classroom is that you're still needed to manage what goes on in the classroom. You're still choosing the activities that would best work for your students. You're still making sure the students are on task. You're still evaluating the students. There's no replacement for the teacher.
Yes.
It's a must. So for those people who are, I've noticed there is a lot of resistance to flipped classroom and flipped classes, because people are like, well, what's the point? Like, why would you need a teacher if you flip? You still absolutely need someone to manage the class. You don't get rid of a teacher. Okay, so that's the 4 pillars. These are some challenges that they mentioned. And the first one I was not really thinking of. Well, actually, this was actually what I just mentioned. The fear that flipped classrooms will further standardize instruction and lead to further the privatization of education and elimination of most teachers. I don't see that happening. I mean, I don't think that we are at a point in any way where we would just eliminate teachers. So I think that fear is fairly unfounded. You still need a form of assessment. You still need someone to manage the class. Did you want to add something?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I
Yeah,
just
no,
wanted
I'm
to
happy.
say that here in this point, also the student's opinion again is important, because even if we are not scared, because we understand that we are teaching speaking, and they need to know how to communicate and so on. It's not just something that's like mathematics that you can learn theory and then be able to add and multiply.
Right.
But the students might not understand. Like they would say, oh my God, why do I pay her if she can't even explain present simple to me? She asked me to read it myself, like this.
That's a good point, and it's interesting that you brought that up, because there are a lot of people who have talked about how we have moved to more learner-centered or learner responsibility. So people like Penny H. Douglas Brown, a whole bunch of people that I'm also not mentioning, but basically what they were looking at is there's been a shift in teacher responsibility and learner responsibility. And one of the outcomes in this is that we actually actively have to teach our learners how to be more responsible for their own learning process. And part of that would be having this conversation with them about why I'm not going to waste your time going over this grammar point with you in class, because you can learn it at home and we can practice it here where I can actually help you. And then at home, you have access to the same presentation and maybe other presentations. So if you didn't get it, you can watch it again and again and again until you get it. And you can do practice activities again and again and again until you get it. Because again, the idea is mastery, not just like, oh, I sort of understand this element, so now let's learn this new element. That if I don't have a solid foundation in this A, I can't do B, but we have to do B because it's in the curriculum next, right? So I think when students understand that, if they have, like, if they're older, they are more willing to be okay with it. But it has to be presented, and it has to, this way of learning has to be taught actively, indirectly and directly. Unequal access to technology among the students is a big problem, obviously. A lot of universities have labs that the students can go to use this information. A lot of secondary schools and primary schools have labs, but if yours doesn't, that would be a problem. And if the students live a very far distance and they couldn't stay after at the lab because they would get home after dark or it takes too long or whatever, that's also a problem. So this is something that needs to be thought about and how to solve this problem. So another is kind of motivation. So when the students go home and they're watching the videos, are they really going to go home and watch the videos? Right? So ideally they do, but you and I both know that that's an ideal. A lot of students won't necessarily go home and watch the video, even though they need to watch it to be able to do what they're going to do in class. So this is a challenge that still has to be thought about. And next week, actually, you will have workshops on Tuesday and Wednesday as well. I won't actually be here. I've pre-recorded the workshop, and it's like a movie. It will play. And I'm talking about independent learning. So we're re-exploring this topic. We've talked about it previously. For some of you, it may be a review. But I go through enough detail so that if you've not been here before, you'll gather all of the meaning. And then this group came up actually with a great way to assess students that gets them excited about actually participating in quizzes online and videos. And they use a form of gamification. So I talk in a lot more detail about what that looks like next week. So if you come back again, it's Tuesday and Wednesday. So what's about flipping is that you have multiple sources that you're getting comprehension from. You have the videos, you have the readings, you have the in-class sources as well. In terms of interaction, it's meaningful because you're interacting even more with your peers than you would, as well as with the teacher. Because the teacher has more time, instead of just giving the lecture, but to go around and to listen and to intervene when there are moments that students need you to intervene to answer a question or to make a correction, etc. Or to have even a mini lesson about something, right? And then critical thinking skills. So a lot of what flipping does is it has you start doing tasks and or project-based learning in the classroom with English language. And the whole point behind task-based learning and project-based learning is it engages Bloom's taxonomy, if you're familiar with that, and the higher skills. I think Mike talked about that a few weeks ago, where you want students to be evaluating. You want them to be analyzing and synthesizing and getting to the point of creation, which is the highest one. So a lot of them are intellectually challenging and get you thinking. using the higher levels. So how it fits into a classroom, you have two elements. This was taken from Yu Jung-han. You have educational technology and learning through activity. Those are the two elements that you have in the flipped classroom. The educational technology is what they're doing at home, right? And in some cases, if you are using it in the class as well as part of the project. So an example of this would be like Google Site and Google Voice, and having the students using that, watching, going to the Google site to do quizzes and practice activities, and or watching videos that you've posted, maybe from YouTube, explaining different grammar points or topics, etc., etc. And this is a meaning-focused, it's hard to see that, but that says meaning-focused and language-focused input. So they're getting both meaning and language, and they're getting it, right? Over here, with learning through activity, all of these are cooperative activities. So most of the time they're going to be in pairs or small groups. And you have, again, meaning-focused output and fluency development. So you see it's very balanced. You have the input and the output. It's meaningful, so the students are engaged. It's more likely they're going to be able to remember the information and their use of the language and how they used it. And you have the opportunity to focus on fluency development and how and if they're able to use English and encourage the use of English in class. So that is how you flip the classroom in terms of the two elements that you have to take into consideration when doing so. So finally, I've already mentioned these because these were part of the earlier question. Simple ways to flip. So how we can do this tomorrow if we wanted to. Very easy. This was from the Robin from Berkeley. So she said that you can assign the ESL textbook materials as homework and apply and or discuss how the strategies work in class. You can find online lectures or readings and assign those as homework, and in class you're doing practice activities or projects based on tasks, because maybe projects are long-term, tasks would be more reasonable because they could be completed within the time period of the class itself. But these are things that you could start doing already, you know, collecting lectures, going through like 15 minutes every Saturday, find a new lecture, watch it, decide if you like it or you don't like it, and start collecting them. And then she also had that students can read papers outside of class and then apply the reading strategies in class when they get back, or draft sections of their own papers also in class. So these are some ways to flip now to kind of practice to get students used to doing things differently. So you're training them, basically. Okay. Questions, comments, or concerns? No? So I hope that wasn't too heavy, especially the first part. But I thought that there was a lot going on at AAAL this year that I thought was very meaningful and is helpful to start a discussion about in our academic communities. And I think, like I said, flipping is more and more popular every year, and so I think that this will eventually find its way into your classroom. The more familiar you are with it, the better placed you'll be if it comes to pass that we're all flipped. Okay, so if you have no questions, comments, or concerns, thank you very much for your attention. As I mentioned, next week we will have independent learning as the topic. We've already talked a little bit about that, and it's the same time, right, 4 each day, or is there a webinar?
No,